Hi students, I hope you have listened to my previous lecture on the essay what is an author. So in the previous lectures we have seen how Foucault was explaining the author as a historical construction, and also how the author name is not a proper name, though it is a proper name, because it has some additional functions or duties to be performed in a given culture, because a discourse gets woven around the author's name in any given culture. We know that. So of course he says that there may be discourses which are having author function and which are not having author function also in a given society or in a given culture. So, of course, the idea behind explaining what is an author, of course, what is an author? Author is nothing but a construction. Yet, he did not approve, like other post structuralist critics, like Barthes, perhaps Derrida also, that he did not approve along with them that the author, of course, should be erased or should be removed. That cannot happen, though it was declared by the death of the author, okay, by Roland Barthes. We'll be uh, going through that essay also. So, as Barthes declares the death of the author, a very rebellious idea, some feel that it's a very notorious idea also. Foucault feels that it is not simply enough to declare the author's death, because there will be a vacuum, an emptiness after the declaration of the death of the author. So, what is going to be, uh, filled in that gap or in that vacuum? That is more important. Further, the death of the author, of course, is the declaration is making him more alive in other ways, because we become curious to know how it is happening, and also the concept of the work, how it keeps the worker, that is the artist, okay, work of art, a piece of literature is a work of art. So how that concept is keeping the concept of author very much alive in a given society. That is what we have seen. And then he discussed the features of the contemporary writing, which of course are not having any duties of expression now. So, writing or language is freed from the duty of expression now. The modern contemporary writing, that is literature, according to Foucault, some characteristics which are and he says that it has something to do with immortality and death. So he discussed the Greek culture where the heroes are made immortal by writing, and the Asian Arabian culture where death is postponed. Okay, literature or narrating becomes a tool to postpone death and finally to cancel it, as it happens with the Arabian Nights, a thousand lives, thousand nights. So that also he expressed. And coming to the European culture, he says that the European culture has metamorphosed this idea of immortality or postponing the death into a concept like the death of the author. So, the metamorphosis, is it for good or bad? Of course, how the author figure stands very vibrant, very alive, he emanated or originated historically, how, etc. And he discussed, and then he says that any discourse that is having surrounding the author has four functions. That's what he described as author functions, four author functions. Let me just share the screen now. I hope the screen is visible to you. Yeah. Now, the screen actually Foucault says that there are four author functions. We have discussed those four functions, and after that, he elaborated on the discursive texts. So, to recall, what are the four author functions we have here? The author function is linked to the juridical and institutional system that encompasses, determines, and articulates the universe of discourses. This is like the author function is appropriate for the penal appropriations, penal appropriation. That is what he says. It is linked with the judicial and institutional system. So he mentioned in that point how the authorship became necessary because when someone is talking against the institution or established practice, like between the bipolar fields of sacred, profane, licit, illicit, okay, religious, blasphemy, etc. It was necessary to assign an author to any discourse that is against any institution or state or religion, in any ideology for that matter. So then Foucault says that there we of course find the genesis of author. So it is penal appropriation according to him, and that was what necessitated the genesis of the author. So that is the first function. And then second one is, it does not affect all discourses in the same way at all times and in all times of civilization. So it is not constant, it's not uniform. And we have seen how their how the beginnings literature has no author, in the sense author is not wanted for the texts of literature, whereas it was for sciences. But during 18th centuries, he says that the scene got reversed, and there was necessity for the author in literature, whereas the science has freed itself from this concept of author. That's what he explained, and we have seen that. And then while coming to the third, it is not defined by the spontaneous attribution of a discourse. It's a very complex, gradually built construction. It's a construction. So author function is a construction. It is not spontaneous, not produced by any individual, etc. And of course, there he mentions how you know texts of anonymous texts were given author following a certain criteria, like Saint Jerome's, etc. And he feels that even now literary criticism, of course, follows that. And then fourth is, it does not refer purely and simply to a real individual. So when we say author function, it is not simply referring to the real individual. Because whatever is written in any book, of course, we know that is not of authors alone or individuals alone. And he says literature is capable of offering simultaneously several selves, several subjects, positions, etc., that can be occupied by different classes of individuals. So, author, of course, is not an individual. And the discourse gets developed depending upon his work or works, and therein we find multiplicity. Okay, this is what he, of course, shared regarding the author functions. And then he follows um, to explain why he limited the concept of author only to the author of a book. Why not for an author of a painting or music or sculpture, etc.? Of course, he explains the limitation, that is only to limit himself, and of course, to take the discourse and in a general manner, the literature, the discourse in literature. And then he proceeds to explain that there are some books, of course, not, though we may not be able to consider them as literature, because the other social sciences, and how some authors coming from other social sciences were able to establish a kind of founders of discursivity. That is what he says. They are the founders of discursivity, and they are none other than Marx and Freud. So, how their theories were a foundation for many other theories to be developed in the discourse of literature or any other social science, not only in literature. Of course, based on Marxism or based on psychological theories of, say, Freud or Lacan or Jung, etc., we have many, many literary theories that came into existence. Of course, with Marx also. So, he says that besides the texts of literature, they, and of course, in a way, he believes that rather than the texts of literature or any moment or period in literature, um, these two are more discursive. That is why he mentions them as founders of discursivity. Of course, he takes the example of Anne Radcliffe for Gothic um, novels, yet he, of course, says that they are not as discursive as the works of, say, Marx or Freud. So, after explaining that, he proceeds to uh, conclude his essay, which of course gives us some more ideas why Foucault has taken up this issue of defining what an author is. You know, of course, he didn't give us any definite definitions as such, but he tries to explain the genesis, how the author figure was constructed at a point of individuation and individualization, and how strong he holds even now. So, just to say that the author is erased or removed or disappeared or dead is not simply enough, according to Foucault. So, to conclude, he says, I would like to review the reasons why I attach a certain importance to what I have said. So, what he said, that is the author function. And also how texts outside literature are more discursive. Uh, so, why he attached, why he explained all that, he concludes. That is Perhaps for two reasons, he says. So, firstly, on the one hand, an analysis in the direction that I have outlined might provide for an approach to a typology of discourse. So, he says that whatever I have given here should bring in a typology of discourse, a typology, like a science of discourse. Oh, it seems to me, at least at first glance, that such a typology cannot be constructed solely from the grammatical features, formal structures, and objects of discourse. More likely, there exist properties or relationships peculiar to discourse, not reducible to the rules of grammar and logic. And one must use these to distinguish the major categories of discourse. So, the relationship or non relationship with an author, and the different forms this relationship takes constitute in a quite visible manner one of these discursive properties. So, on the one hand, he says that we need to develop a typology of discourse, and a discourse cannot be constructed based entirely on the text of the author, like grammatical features, formal structures, and objects of discourse refer to literature and text actually. And he feels that there exist properties or relationship peculiar to discourse. Now, discourse is beyond the grammatical features, formal structures, etc. So that is why we cannot always reduce a discourse to the rules of grammar and logic. And one must use these to distinguish the major categories of discourse. So only thing is, he says that we have to use these ideas that are presented in this essay to um, identify the difference between the major categories of discourse. So the relationship or non-relationship with an author, and the different forms this relationship takes constitute in a quite visible manner one of these discursive properties. So he says the discourse, of course, depends upon how the author is related or how the author is kept aside of the work. And we have to, of course, understand how they constitute some kind of visible manner one of these discursive properties. So one thing why he has given importance to literature or an author of a book, especially if not literature. Okay, so this is one reason, because there are different discourses, and discourses, of course, are not always confined to the grammar, formal structures, etc. And we have to take into consideration so many other things also to develop a discourse. And then, on the other hand, I believe that one could find here an introduction to the historical analysis of discourse. So, in this essay, what we come across is a historical analysis of the concept of discourse, how the discourse on the other has developed and how it was constructed, how it was changing, and of course dynamic, etc. And perhaps it is time to study discourses not only in terms of their expressive value or formal transformations, but according to their modes of existence. So he says we should develop a new approach to study discourses. So they should not be always termed or studied from, not only from the terms of their expressive values or transformations, but their modes of existence, how they have been existing in a given culture, is what is the historical analysis also. The modes of circulation, how they get circulated, valorization, how they acquire value, how they are attributed with different things or different discourses, and appropriation of discourse, etc., vary with each culture and are modified within each. So, in a culture, it depends how this discursive concepts or discourses, of course, differ from culture to culture, and how they operate, and how they change within the culture, and they, of course, change from one culture to the other. And the manner in which they are articulated according to social relationships can be more readily understood. Of course, he says that the discourse is will get affected with the social relationships. I believe in the activity of the author function and in its modifications than in the themes or concepts that discourses set in motion. So he says he believes in the author function and in its modifications. Of course, author function is not universal, not spontaneous, not uniform, we have seen. So that is what he says he believes in. It would seem that one could also, beginning with the analysis of this type, re-examine the privilege of the subject. So, of course, if we follow the ideas of Foucault, there is a chance that we'll try to re-examine the privileges of the subject. I realize that in undertaking the internal and architectonic analysis of a work, be it a literary text, philosophical system, or scientific work, in setting aside biographical and psychological references, one has already called back into question the absolute character and founding role of the subject. So, of course, though literature or philosophy or science have tried to keep away the subject, that is the author, but Foucault feels that the very idea of keeping him away, of course, makes us more involved into the absolute character of the subject. So it gives more what you call attention. Still, perhaps one must return to this question, not in order to re-establish the theme of an originating subject, but to grasp the subject's points of insertion, modes of functioning, and system of dependencies. So, it is not our involvement with the subject when it is being declared as being detached or removing, etc., will be more into this, according to Foucault, if not to re-ascertain the position of the subject, but to grasp the uh, subject's points of insertion, where he was influencing, where the discourse is being influenced, how it is functioning in a given culture, that is author function, and how the system of dependencies is there. So how we have to define, depend upon many things that are related to subject in order to establish a kind of typology of discourse. So that is where Foucault says this is very important. Doing so means overturning the traditional problem. So Foucault feels that if we are probing into this again and again, even after declaration of the death or the disappearance of the author, of course the probe results in more questions. So, what are these questions? How can we free subject penetrate the density of things and give it meaning? How can it activate the rules of a language from within and thus give rise to the designs that are properly its own? Instead, these questions will be raised. How, under what conditions, in what forms can something like a subject appear in the order of discourse? So, if you see this paragraph, Foucault says that these many questions we will be encountering when we are trying to devalue or devalorize the subject, and when we are bent upon the removal of the figure who is called the author. In short, it is a matter of depriving the subject for it or its substitute of its role as originator, and of analyzing the subject as a variable and complex function of discourse. Of course, we are removing the subject from its object, but we have many questions that have to be answered, and of course we will feel the presence of the subject as a variable in another form and complex function of discourse. In the complex function of a discourse is not a simple thing. Of course it is a very dynamic thing. How a discourse gets developed, in what conditions, and so many things gets involved into a kind of development of discourse, as we have seen in Bakhtin, in Derrida, etc. So this is the one thing why he took interest in explaining the author of a book. Not certainly the book of literature, because here you can see literature, the author of a literature is not that much discursive according to Foucault. And yeah, of course, he gave that plane to the social sciences, they like Marx and Freud. So this to make us understand how complex these concepts are, and is it simply uh, enough if we declare the disappearance or removal or the death? That's what we have to question. So it may not, it is not so, because a discourse is not a simple thing. It's a very complex function that takes place in a culture. So author is also a discourse. Now, secondly, there are reasons dealing with the ideological status of the author. So he is trying to examine the ideological status of the author. The question then becomes, how can one reduce the great peril, the great danger with which fiction threatens our world? The answer is, one can reduce it with the author. The author allows a limitation of the cancerous and dangerous proliferation of significations within a word, where one is thrifty not only with one's resources and riches, but also with one's discourses and their significations. So, how can we reduce the great peril, that is, the great danger with which the fiction threatens our world? So, fiction, of course, if we keep the author away, there is no end to the meaning. That is what we have learned in Derrida, of course in Bakhtin also. But Foucault says that this is going to be perilous if we remove the author. He's saying it becomes cancerous and dangerous because there is no limiting agent. And one's, thrifty not only with one's resources and riches, but also with one's discourses and their significations. If we remove the author from the text, there is a peril of proliferation of significations, which may prove cancerous also. I mean, fatal at times. The author is the principle of thrift in the proliferation of meaning. So Foucault feels that author is the principle of thrift. Saving the proliferation of meaning. As a result, we must entirely reverse the traditional idea of the author. So, of course, there is a need to reverse the traditional idea of the author. We are accustomed, as we have seen earlier, to saying that the author is the genial creator of a work in which he deposits with infinite wealth and generosity an inexhaustible world of significations. So, the traditional meaning of the author we have to revive. We are used to thinking that the author is so different from all other men, and to transcendent with regard to all languages, that as soon as he speaks, meaning begins to proliferate indefinitely. Of course, the author is a divine personality in the traditional system. That should be revised. So, we should not try to assign any kind of, authority to the author. Is not a transcendental figure. We should come out of that ideology that is woven around the name of the author. The ideology that got developed around the author and the personality of the author, etc., is what led to the deconstruction or declarations of the death of the author. So, we have, of course, there is a need that we should revive the traditional conception of the author. Because author cannot be taken as a very intellectual or transcendental being. So he says, what is the truth? The truth is quite the contrary. The author is not an indefinite source of significations that fill a work. The author does not precede the works. He is a certain functional principle by which, in our culture, one limits, excludes, and chooses. In short, by which one impedes the free circulation, the free manipulation, the free composition, decomposition, and recomposition of fiction. So, of course, author is a functional principle that limits the, proliferation of significations of fiction. In fact, if we are accustomed to presenting the author as a genius, as a perpetual surviving of invention, It is because in reality, we make him function in exactly the opposite fashion. One can say that the author is an ideological product. So, what is the ideological status that is or that has constructed the author's personality, mm, giving him the divinity, etc. So, and of course, the you know that traditional idea of the divine personality of the author is also not good, and freeing the text wholly from the author, of course, um, may not be, completely it is not good, because that leads to the perilous proliferations. So, Foucault says that author is an ideological product. Some may say he is ideological since we represent him as the opposite of his historically real function. So, we always consider him as an ideological product or figure, keeping him in contradiction to the historically real function. When a historically given function is represented in a figure that inverts it, one has an ideological production. So the author is therefore the ideological figure by which one marks the manner in which we fear the proliferation of meaning. So, in saying this, I seem to call for a form of culture in which fiction would not be limited by the figure of the author. It would be pure romanticism. However, to imagine a culture in which the fictive would operate in an absolutely free state, in which fiction would be put at the disposal of everyone and would develop without passing through something like a necessary or constraining figure. So, the two ways of, the extremes of traditional or modern, of course, is not accepting. And of course, he says that we should not limit the fiction fixing to the author, yet we have to check the proliferation also. And in which fiction would be put as the disposal of everyone and would develop without passing through something like a necessary or constraining figure. Although since the 18th century, the author has played the role of the regulator of the fictive, a role quite characteristic of our area, of our era of industrial and bourgeois society, of individualism and private property. Still, given the historical modifications that are taking place, it does not seem necessary that the author function remain constant in form, complexity, and even its existence. So, the ideological status of the author, according to Foucault, is varying, and we have to take, while defining the author, these variations or this what you say, up and downs or metamorphoses or transformations should be taken into account to decide or define what is an author. And then he actually says that as our society changes, at the very moment when it is in the process of changing, the author function will disappear and in such a manner that fiction and its polysemistics will once again function according to another mode, but still with a system of constraint, one that will no longer be the author but will have to be determined or perhaps experienced. So, author, of course, though we declare to be dead, will be living, of course, in another form. Whenever there is a change in the society, the author function also gets changed. And once again, function according to another mode. Of course, there will be a system of constraint in that. All discourses, whatever their status, form, value, and whatever the treatment to which they will be subjected, would then develop in the anonymity of a murmur. So, of course, if we detach the author, of course, discourse will not get stopped. It will get keeps developing, of course, anonymity in the murmur of the anonymity. We would no longer hear the questions that have been rehearsed for so long. Who really spoke? Is it really he and not someone else? With what authenticity or originality? And what part of his deepest self did he express in his discourse? Such questions. Because if we validate the author as a person, as an individual, okay? Because the mm, third function, author function, I think, is that fourth function is that he says author function will not get developed around surrounding a single individual. It's not particularly author. So, if that is so, we will have these questions. But Foucault is telling that we have to come out of these questions. Instead, there would be other questions like what are the modes of existence of this discourse? Where has it been used? How can it circulate and who can appropriate it for himself? What are the places in it where there is a room for possible subjects? Who can assume these various subject functions? Oh, these are all dependent upon the author functions, the discourses of author functions. So, if we break the traditional ideological status of the author, we will develop another ideology where, of course, the proliferation, uh, is limited, and then, of course, it takes another form according to Foucault. And behind all this, he says, we would hear hardly anything but the stirring of an indifference. What difference does it make who is speaking? So, whoever it is speaking, perhaps, when we change the questions from who is speaking to, if we stop taking interest, of course, there develops a kind of indifference, as Foucault says. And what difference does it make who is speaking? So even then also there is, of course, no change. So the only his idea is that we have to focus on the historical concept or historical evolution of the author, and should not be what you say limit to the traditional ideological status of an author, because the divine personality of the author is no more valid. The author is not omniscient or omnipresent. So we have to consider, okay, how the author limits the proliferation of significations uh, in his absence. uh, with his presence, and even in his absence also. Of course, there will be a proliferation, but Foucault says that it is not always around the author figure, uh, or the absence of the author that we have to develop a discourse or examine a discourse, but we have to take many things into consideration. So, this is how, of course, Foucault concludes what is an author. So, perhaps this idea of Foucault is to say, what is an author? Author is a discourse, a historical construction, of course, a dynamic. Author is a dynamic concept. The author is a concept. It is not, what do you say, an individual. But we should the ideological status of the author we should properly understand. So, author, whenever we listen, is not always an individual that should come into our mind, but it is construction, a historical concept, it's a discourse, and perhaps an ideology. And that ideology cannot survive uh, individually on the concept of author alone, because there are many things that come into play when a kind of discourse is getting developed in a given culture. So, this is what Foucault says, and how author functions, of course, are there in any given culture, etc. With this, I am concluding this essay. And the possible questions are like, what are the four author functions that Foucault explains in his essay? What is an author? And also, you may get some kind of short answers that are discursive. Who are the founders of discursivity according to Foucault in the European tradition? That is Freud and Marx. Okay, to the mention of Freud and Marx, and then why he has given importance to the concept of author of a book. May not be a very important question, but you may get. So, the first important question is author functions. Four author functions. They are very much clearly given in the essay. You can make a notes out of this essay itself. You may not be able to get any answer from other Google sources also. Listen to the lectures. I have discussed two functions in one lecture and the other two in another lecture. And in today's lecture also, I have summed up the four functions. So you can take the summing up paragraph from this essay itself and you can develop your own answer. So I am concluding this here. And if you have any doubts, of course, you can post in the group, or if you ask for an online class, of course, we can have that just to clarify your doubts. Hope you are all listening to the lectures regularly, because once the pandemic situation gets cleared, you may have exams with short notices. So please don't neglect your studies. Keep studying, at least keep listening to the classes. Okay, have a nice time.